The fluorescent lights hummed their endless monotone as Laura Bennett pushed the supply cart down the corridor of Oak Creek Memorial, her pale blue scrubs catching the overhead glow like water on concrete. 3 years. She had folded linens, restocked crash carts, and answered call lights at this Houston hospital for exactly 1,095 days, and in all that time, no one had asked her name twice. The antiseptic smell clung to everything here, her clothes, her hair, her skin, a chemical reminder that she existed in the margins of other people's emergencies. Her left leg carried a slight hitch when she walked, barely perceptible to anyone not trained to notice compensatory movement. The injury had healed years ago, but the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Shrapnel had entered her leg in a pattern that looked almost geometric, entry wounds that traced a line from her knee to her hip. She wore long sleeves even in Houston's heat because the forearms told a different story entirely, one that required explanations she was no longer permitted to give. The break room locker held one photograph. She opened it each shift, looked at the face, and closed it again without speaking. Her son in dress uniform, 19 years old, taken exactly 2 weeks before Marjah. Before the operation they'd ordered classified above top secret. Before she'd been told that Major Laura Bennett had died in a compound fire, that her existence needed to be erased, that surfacing would compromise an intelligence network built on the fiction of her death. Before everything. So she pushed supply carts. She restocked shelves. She said yes when the ER needed someone for the night shifts no one else wanted. Her hands moved through inventory with the precision of someone who'd done it under mortar fire, checking medication counts, verifying equipment serial numbers, running her fingers along the edges of sterile packages. Just a nurse. That's what the chart said. That's what the hospital believed. That's what kept her alive and invisible, the only identity she'd been allowed to keep. The ER doors hissed open at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the automatic glass panels parted like a mouth. Orderlies wheeled in a gurney carrying a man whose spine had been shattered by an improvised explosive device somewhere in a desert Laura had walked through in another life. Sergeant Marcus Hayes. The chart read it plainly. Age 34. Spinal injury. Experimental pain implant candidate. Admitted through the ER because his regular physician had refused to touch his case, citing liability concerns and 3 different policy violations that everyone in the building understood meant nobody wanted to risk it. His sister walked beside the gurney, her face wet with tears that hadn't stopped falling since the ambulance left his apartment. She held his hand. She whispered things he couldn't hear over his own screaming. Laura's hands froze on a package of sterile gauze. Sewn into the lining of Sergeant Hayes's jacket, barely visible when the orderlies adjusted his position on the gurney, was a faded patch. Olive drab fabric worn soft by time and sweat. A number, 75. A Ranger scroll. The 75th Regiment. Her son's unit. The unit that had trained him, deployed him, and sent him to a compound in Marjah where everything had gone wrong in the space of 8 minutes. Her breath caught once. She didn't let it catch again. She closed the supply cabinet with the deliberate slowness of someone performing a meditation, each motion controlled and separate from the next. The gauze stayed in her hand. The locker closed with a soft metallic click that nobody heard over the sound of Marcus Hayes screaming and his sister crying and the organized chaos of an ER receiving a new admission. Dr. Richard Caldwell arrived 3 minutes later, his silk tie the color of aged money, Italian leather shoes that cost more than Laura made in a week, his nose wrinkled as if the entire hospital smelled of something he found beneath him. He carried Marcus's chart in one hand and a coffee mug in the other, the kind of china you didn't see in break rooms, the kind that came from home. His eye scanned the documentation with the expression of someone reviewing a maintenance problem that would require significant budget adjustment. Laura moved to the medication dispensary, but her peripheral vision tracked everything. Caldwell's mouth as he read the words experimental pain management implant. The slight elevation of his eyebrows when he reached the section about the spinal injury complexity. The way his fingers tapped against the tablet 3 times, once, twice, 3, in a pattern that suggested calculation rather than concern. She had seen that expression before, on officers deciding which soldiers to reassign, which missions to approve, which lives counted as acceptable losses. The sister's voice rose from the trauma bay. Please, he's in so much pain. He just needs someone to try. He's a good man. He's a decorated soldier. Please. Caldwell did not respond. He continued reading his tablet, the coffee mug pausing halfway to his lips. His gaze moved from the chart to Marcus Hayes, visible through the transparent wall of the trauma bay, and then back to the chart again. Assessment. Dismissal. Mental calculation of something that had nothing to do with medicine. Laura's hands completed their work at the medication dispensary. She verified the counts with the precision of someone who had once inventoried ammunition, weapons, and field supplies under conditions that allowed no margin for error. 20 units of morphine. 12 units of hydromorphone. 7 units of fentanyl. Everything balanced. Everything accounted for. Everything denied to a man screaming 3 rooms away. She moved toward the ER proper, and that's when the sister's voice changed. Not louder. Clearer. A specific kind of desperation that stripped away all pretense and left only truth underneath. My brother fought for this country. He led men. He lost everything serving. Can't someone here just help him? Laura's step hesitated. Just fractionally. Just enough to confirm what she already knew from that patch stitched into an old jacket lining. The 75th Regiment patch. Her son had worn one identical to it, sewn into his uniform the day he graduated from Ranger School. Ranger regiments trained leaders. They trained men who held other men's lives in their hands. They trained soldiers like Marcus Hayes. They trained soldiers like the 19-year-old her son had been. She continued walking, her limp barely noticeable. Dr. Caldwell stood near the nurse's station, tablet still in hand, reviewing something that made his jaw tighten. His silk tie caught the fluorescent light. His Italian shoes had not touched a patient's floor in 3 years. Laura knew this because she had worked in the ER long enough to know which doctors actually saw patients and which ones managed the legal and financial architecture that prevented certain doctors from seeing certain patients. 15 physicians had reviewed Marcus Hayes' chart over the course of his initial assessment 3 weeks ago. The ER nurses kept track of these things, the way sailors keep track of storm warnings. 3 had declared his experimental pain implant too risky to manage. 4 had cited liability concerns and insurance implications. 5 had written in their notes, with the kind of clinical detachment that disguised simple refusal, that he was likely opioid-seeking based on his medical history, as if asking for pain medication when your spine had been shattered by explosives was a character flaw rather than a medical reality. 3 more had simply transferred off his care without explanation, leaving a trail of blank spots in his chart where providers should have been. 15 doctors. All of them competent. All of them licensed. All of them bound by an oath that somehow permitted them to see a broken soldier and turn away. Laura had not read any of those notes. She simply knew this the way you know things when you work in hospitals long enough to understand how the system actually functioned beneath its official documentation. The invisible architecture. The careful deniability. The absence that was actually a choice. Nurse Bennett. She turned. Dr. Caldwell stood with Marcus's chart in hand, his eyes moving across her with the kind of assessment that didn't extend to questions about what she might actually know or have actually done. Just another staff member. Just another person in the background managing tasks while the important people made important decisions. Monitor his vitals, Caldwell said. His voice carried the tone of someone giving instructions to equipment. Notify attending when he's stabilized. We'll evaluate implant feasibility after preliminary imaging. Yes, doctor, Laura said. The words came out soft. Deferential. Exactly what he expected to hear. Her voice had become very good at saying yes to things. Her face had become very practiced at showing nothing underneath. 3 years of that. 3 years of learning to be invisible while remaining present, to work while remaining unseen, to carry knowledge that had to be buried deeper than any grave. Dr. Caldwell's Italian shoes carried him away from the nurse's station, back toward his office, back to whatever calculations occupied the careful architecture of his day. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song. The heart monitor in the trauma bay beeped its mechanical rhythm, monitoring the pain of a soldier whose own body had become a battlefield, whose spinal cord had been shattered by an explosion that had also shattered everything else he had been before. Laura walked toward the supply cabinet, moving between the organized chaos of the emergency room with a kind of practiced precision that came from having lived in actual chaos, in the moments when precision was all that kept people alive. The patch had been in his jacket lining. The 75th Regiment. Her son's unit. The supply cabinet closed behind her with a soft metallic sound that nobody else heard. The supply cabinet closed behind her with a soft metallic sound that nobody else heard. Laura stood in the hallway for 3 seconds. Just 3. Her hand steady at her sides. Her breathing level. Then she moved back to the unit, where the morning census was climbing and the first wave was already beginning. Room 347 held Sergeant Marcus Hayes and the weight of institutional indifference. The first doctor arrived at 7:45 a.m. Dr. Mitchell, orthopedic surgery. He reviewed Marcus's chart at the nursing station, his face tightening as he read the experimental implant specifications. Laura watched from 5 feet away, knowing what was coming before he opened his mouth. He looked up at her and said, "The liability on this prosthetic is astronomical." "I'm not touching it." He handed the chart back without making eye contact. Gone. By 9 a.m., 2 more had refused. Dr. Patel from Infectious Disease spent 90 seconds scanning Marcus's file, then handed it off to a resident with the words, "Too risky. Recommend palliative care consult." Dr. Brennan, internal medicine, didn't even enter the room. He read the chart in the hallway, made a note, and told Laura, "This implant is experimental hardware. If something goes wrong, we're liable. Find someone else." The door to room 347 remained closed behind him. 3 doctors. 3 refusals based on risk management, not medicine. 3 names Laura documented with timestamps in the margin of Marcus's progress notes. The second wave came between noon and 3 p.m. Dr. Hassan from Pain Management walked into room 347 at 1 o'clock and saw Marcus's sister holding his hand while he groaned, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than pain, a place where the nervous system had begun to fail. Hassan spent 4 minutes examining the implant site, then stepped into the hallway. Laura was waiting. He said, "Another opioid-seeking vet trying to get disability bumped up. Not my problem." He walked away before she could respond. 3 more followed. Dr. Kumar, neurology, "I won't manage complex post-operative complications from experimental devices. Liability nightmare." Dr. Reeves, surgery, "That implant is out of my scope. Transfer him elsewhere." Dr. Fontaine, pain management, "Look, I see 100 guys like this every month. Half of them are just shopping for pills. I'm reassigning. 6 doctors now. Gone without solutions. Gone without care plans. Gone without explaining to Marcus why room 347 had become a room where nobody came. By late afternoon, 3 more reviewed his chart and requested immediate reassignment from his case without stepping into the room or speaking to him. They left notes. Signatures without conversation. Documentation without presence. 15 doctors. 15 refusals across 48 hours. Laura had counted every one. She stood at the nursing station at 5:30 p.m., watching the evening rounds beginning. Dr. Caldwell moved through the unit with the efficient cruelty of someone who had learned that indifference was cheaper than compassion. For residents trailed behind him, medical students watching the master class of institutional self-protection. 2 other nurses flanked the group. Marcus's sister sat in room 347, her eyes red from 2 days of watching her brother deteriorate while medicine looked away. Laura moved in front of Caldwell as he approached room 347. She held the chart open to the vital signs page. "Sir, Sergeant Hayes needs immediate intervention or the infection will become septic within hours. His white count is elevated. Temperature spiking. The implant site is showing signs of Nurse Bennett. Caldwell's voice had the texture of ice scraping across a windshield. He stopped walking. The resident stopped. The nurses stopped. Marcus's sister appeared in the doorway of room 347, watching. Your emotional involvement clouds your judgment. The words landed like a blade. This patient requires physician-level decision-making, Caldwell continued, speaking not to Laura but to the residents, as if she were a teaching case in how nurses overstepped. Not maternal instinct from someone who pins on a name badge. One of the residents laughed nervously. Another looked at his shoes. Caldwell turned to Marcus's sister and said, I apologize that Florence Nightingale here thinks she outranks 15 medical doctors. The sister's hand went to her mouth. Laura took one measured breath. Deep into her diaphragm. The kind of breath taught in field hospitals under mortar fire. Her left eye produced a single tear, not from emotion but from the deliberate closing of her throat, the physiological response to rage compressed into complete stillness. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact. Her jaw remained unclenched. Her voice, when she spoke, came out steady as a surgical laser. I've seen men with more courage bleed out in the dirt, doctor. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of a break room. This was the silence of the operating theater when the patient crashes and everyone understands they are witnessing a moment. Caldwell's face flushed. His jaw tightened visibly. A vein appeared at his temple. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and continued rounds without responding, the residents following like pilot fish behind a shark. Laura stood holding the chart. She did not move. She did not cry. She did not lower her gaze. She waited until Caldwell and his entourage had moved down the hallway, then she returned to room 347 and told Marcus's sister, I'm going to document everything. Every vital sign. Every refusal. Everything. That night at 6:30 p.m., Laura sat in the break room with a container of yogurt and a spoon. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The coffee machine gurgled in the corner. She was alone except for 3 other nurses and an orderly, all eating quietly at the far table. One of them stood. Then another. Then all of them. They collected their trays and their bags, and they filed past Laura in complete silence. The orderly, who had known her for 3 years, would not meet her eyes. The nurses, including Jennifer, who had worked beside her through 14 double shifts, walked past without acknowledgement. The break room door closed behind them. Laura sat under the fluorescent light, the spoon suspended above her yogurt. The silence was the kind that had texture, the kind that moved through the room like weather. She took one bite. Then she stood and threw the rest away. The next morning, she arrived at 7 a.m. to find a formal write-up pinned to the unit board beside the roster. Her name in bold. Bennett, Laura. 9 policy violations documented in Caldwell's handwriting. Failure to follow physician orders. Insubordination. Creating hostile work environment. Inappropriate commentary toward attending physicians. Exceeding scope of practice. Failure to report chain of command. Unauthorized clinical judgment. Unprofessional conduct. And the 9th one, typed out in full, engaging in emotional manipulation of patient families to undermine medical authority. All of it false. All of it documented. All of it permanent. Laura read the write-up 3 times. She did not remove it. She walked to room 347, where Marcus lay with fever burning across his face and his infection growing in the silence of 15 absent doctors. His sister was asleep in the corner chair, her hand still on his blanket. Laura checked his vitals. Heart rate 118 and climbing. Blood pressure dropping. Temperature 104.1 degrees. The implant site was swollen to twice its normal size, and the surrounding tissue had begun to discolor, the first visual warning that infection was turning systemic. She placed her hand on Marcus's shoulder, and he opened his eyes. I'm going to do everything I can, she said. I promise you that. He nodded. He didn't speak. Men who had been broken by war learned to communicate in gestures and trust. Laura stepped into the hallway and walked to Caldwell's office. He was on a conference call, his feet propped on the mahogany desk, his voice loud and confident as he discussed quarterly numbers with someone on the other end of the line. He saw Laura through the glass, waved her away without interrupting his conversation, and turned his chair so his back was to the door. She knocked. Hard. He ignored her. Continued talking. She knocked again. He muted the call and turned around. Nurse Bennett, I've tolerated your insubordination because I believe in second chances, but you're testing my patience. Return to your assigned duties. Sergeant Hayes is going septic, Laura said. He needs surgical intervention in the next 4 hours or he'll arrest. Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair. He was a man shaped by 23 years of hospital politics, a man who had learned that every problem could be solved by making it someone else's responsibility. He smiled, and it was the smile of someone utterly confident in his authority. Then I suppose we'll see if your judgment was correct, won't we? He unmuted his call. Sorry about that, Jim. Where were we? Laura stood in his doorway for 3 seconds. Her hands trembled once, not from fear but from restraint, from the force required to remain standing instead of walking through him like he was made of paper. Then she turned and walked back to room 347. She found Marcus's sister awake, staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone who understood the mathematics of institutional abandonment. Laura said, "They're letting him die because he's inconvenient." The sister didn't argue. She just gripped Laura's hand, and Laura didn't pull away. At 6 p.m., Laura checked the crash cart for the second time that day. Every instrument inventoried with the precision of someone preparing for combat. The defibrillator pads, the intubation tubes in sizes 7.0 and 8.0, the 14-gauge for needles, the chest tube kit with a surgical blade inside it. She ran her fingers across the metal tray where the thoracotomy instruments lay in their sterile field. She had used these before. In the darkness of Marjah, under different stars, with a knife instead of proper equipment and a man dying on a concrete floor instead of a bed with monitors and nurses standing witness. That man had lived for 4 more years after that night. Long enough to marry his fiancée. Long enough to hold his daughter. Long enough to understand that sometimes the people who save you are the ones the system tries to erase. Marcus Hayes was about to learn that lesson too. But not yet. Not while 15 doctors still held the paperwork. Not while Caldwell still controlled the chain of command. Not while the silence in room 347 remained absolute. Laura closed the crash cart drawer and waited for the infection to spike the fever that would force the code she had already prepared for, the code that would make her choose between protocol and conscience, between career and the man whose commanding officer had once been her son's final thought before the world went black. The third morning arrived with numbers that didn't lie. Laura pulled Marcus's chart from the holder outside room 347 and scanned the labs with the precision of someone reading a battlefield casualty report. White blood cell count, 18,400. Yesterday it was 16,200. The day before, 14,100. The infection was climbing like a fever that wouldn't break, and she knew exactly why, because 15 doctors had reviewed his case and 15 doctors had walked away. 48 hours of refusal had given the sepsis time to dig deeper, spreading through his body like an invading force with no resistance mounted against it. The culture and sensitivity panel showed gram-negative rods multiplying in his bloodstream. Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Hospital-acquired. Preventable if anyone had intervened 2 days ago. Laura stood in the hallway and breathed the antiseptic-soaked air, held the chart against her chest, and waited. She knew what was coming. Pain was information, and his body was screaming it in blood cultures and fever spikes. The pericardial fluid around his heart would thicken next. Then the pressure would start. Then the crush. The same cascade she'd seen in a field hospital in Marjah when infection was allowed to fester because evacuation was impossible, except here, evacuation was everywhere. Just nobody was willing to book a seat. At 7:15 p.m. that evening, Marcus's vitals shifted. Temperature spiked to 103.8. His blood pressure dropped to 94/58. Laura watched his monitor from the nurse's station while completing her rounds on the other patients, her attention split like sonar, waiting for the moment she'd been preparing for since the moment his monitor had first shown a steady rhythm 3 days ago. The nursing staff moved around her with practiced indifference. Caldwell had made certain of that. The isolation wrapped around her like a pressure suit, thick and suffocating, but she'd worn worse. At 9:08 p.m., the monitor in room 347 flatlined. Not a blip. Not a false alarm. A scream of silence so absolute it cut through the entire unit. Laura moved before her conscious mind caught up with her body. The chair scraped backward. Her feet found the tile. She was running, her scrubs flapping like a second skin, muscle memory overriding protocol the way it had overridden protocol in Helmand Province when the blast came through the aid station and half her team stopped breathing. The monitor's alarm wailed behind her, a high mechanical shriek that made people's heads turn, made them reach for phones and radios, made them do everything except what mattered. Marcus's sister was already screaming when Laura reached the doorway. Her hands gripped the chair beside his bed, knuckles white, voice fractured. No, 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 he was fine, he was sleeping. 2 residents burst into the room behind Laura. Both young. Both panicking. Both starting compressions with a kind of urgency that had no precision behind it, their rhythm broken like a metronome with a cracked spring. Step back, Laura said. We've got this, one resident said, sweat already beading on his forehead. Laura placed her hand on his shoulder with a kind of gentleness that was entirely different from permission. I said step back. The weight in her voice, something that had been buried under 3 years of scrubs and humiliation, surfaced like a body that had been weighted down and finally broken free. The residents blinked at her. The one doing compressions hesitated. That hesitation cost 2 seconds they didn't have. Laura stepped into the space they'd occupied. Her hands found the rhythm immediately, steady, perfect tempo, 100 to 120 compressions per minute, the count becoming her heartbeat and his heartbeat simultaneously. 1, 2, 3, 4. The ventilator whooshed. The monitor remained flat. 30 compressions. A breath. 30 more. His sister was sobbing now, the sound of it distant, like something happening in another room. The monitors showed nothing. No electrical activity. No return of spontaneous circulation. ROSC was the prayer every code team whispered, and after 5 minutes with no response, the residents started exchanging glances that said what their lips couldn't shape into words yet: time of death, pronouncement, another patient lost to the system's indifference. Laura saw it before they did because she'd seen it before, in a compound outside Marjah where blast fragmentation had torn a sergeant's right side open and pericardial tamponade had crushed his heart while 3 combat medics watched him die because they didn't have the authority to cut. She saw the distension of his jugular vein. She saw the way his blood pressure had dropped despite compressions. She saw the fluid crushing his heart the way a fist crushes a grape, pressure and inevitability and a death that had nothing to do with his organs failing and everything to do with the weight bearing down. Crash cart, she said. We need a physician, one resident said. For further intervention. Now. The resident ran. Laura never stopped compressions, her hands moving with the terrible grace of someone who'd done this in conditions that would have made a horror film look quaint. The crash cart arrived. She didn't ask permission this time. She retrieved a scalpel, the blade catching the overhead light like a silver tooth. What are you doing? The female resident asked, her voice climbing an octave. You can't, that's outside your scope. Laura made a precise incision between Marcus's 4th and 5th ribs, left anterior lateral thoracotomy position, the same cut she'd made on a 19-year-old Lance Corporal in a FOB outside Sanjin Valley when the IED had shredded his abdomen and shock had drained the color from his skin. The incision was clean. Clinical. Necessary. Blood filled the field. His sister made a sound like something inside her had broken. Laura grabbed the rib spreader and cracked his chest open with controlled force, her hand steady as surgical instruments, steady as they'd been trained to be when there was no margin for error and the only acceptable outcome was breathing. The pericardium appeared, distended and dark, exactly as she'd known it would be. She aspirated the fluid with a needle, 40 milliliters of infected serum that released the pressure like opening a valve on a hydraulic system. The moment it drained, his monitor beeped once. Twice. His rhythm returned, not strong, not perfect, but returning. A heart that had stopped beating found reasons to beat again. Laura's hand entered his chest cavity and began manual massage, her fingers finding the rhythm his own heart had lost, pumping blood through vessels that had forgotten how to do it themselves. 30 seconds. 40. His oxygen saturation began climbing, 68, 72, 79, 84, approaching the threshold of sustainability. His eyes opened. Not conscious. Not aware. But open. His body gasped like something emerging from water. Get me 2 units O negative and start TXA 1 gram over 10, Laura said. The residents moved like they'd been released from a spell, hands finding 4 lines and blood products. Push 1 milligram epi. Get me a 6O proline and prep for closure. Marcus's sister had collapsed against the far wall, tears streaming down her face, her mouth open in a silent scream that had become something else entirely, something like prayer. The monitor showed sinus rhythm. Strong. Regular. The electrical activity of a heart that had died and chosen to live. Laura's hands continued their work, suturing his sternum back together with the methodical precision of someone who understood that closing a wound was its own kind of prayer, each stitch a promise that this had mattered, that the blood and the chaos and the defiance had been worth the risk. That was when Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway. His face went white first. Then the color returned, not the normal flush of exertion, but the deep crimson of a man watching his world realign in a way he couldn't control. He stared at the open thoracotomy, at Laura's blooded glove still working, at the monitor showing a living rhythm where there had been flatline just moments before. His jaw moved without sound for a full 3 seconds before he took one measured step backward into the hallway. Laura didn't watch him go. She finished the last suture, and Marcus's chest was sealed, and the monitor continued its steady beeping like a lighthouse in fog, like permission, like a second chance that no protocol had authorized and every instinct had demanded. The footsteps in the hallway became voices. Caldwell's voice, low and urgent, the tone of a man making phone calls that would alter trajectories. It's me. We have a situation. No, a patient code. A nurse performed an authorized procedure? I need legal standing by. Yes. The security office needs to be notified immediately. Laura removed one glove carefully. Then the other. Her hands emerged bloody and steady. The female resident was staring at her with an expression somewhere between horror and comprehension. You've done this before, the resident whispered. Once, Laura said. In the dark. With less equipment. With no choice. But that wasn't entirely true. There had always been a choice. She'd just never been the kind of person who accepted the wrong answer. The security guards arrived before the bleeding had fully stopped. Before Marcus's vitals had fully stabilized. Before his sister could do anything except collapse into a chair and sob into her hands. 2 of them, with badges and the careful posture of men who didn't understand what they were walking into. The administrator followed behind them, tablet in hand, moving with the kind of administrative urgency that treated human crisis as a scheduling conflict. Nurse Bennett, your access badge is deactivated effective immediately. We need you to come with us, please. Laura looked at her hands, still gloved in blood that wasn't hers, at the monitor showing the heart she'd held in her hands just moments ago still beating. She looked at Marcus's sister, whose tears had become something harder now, something that looked almost like gratitude. I need to finish closure, Laura said quietly. Your access is terminated, the administrator repeated, the tablet becoming a barrier between them, a symbol of authority that existed only in documents and policy manuals. Please come with us now. The security guards took positions on either side. Laura removed her gloves with the same methodical precision she'd used to crack Marcus's chest open, each movement deliberate, making the moment last because she understood something fundamental about moments like this: they were the hinges on which entire lives swung open. As she walked past Marcus's bed, his eyes were still closed, but his breathing had found its own rhythm now, independent and strong and entirely, unmistakably alive. Dr. Caldwell arrived as Marcus's sinus rhythm stabilized on the monitor, his entrance preceded by the sound of his Italian loafers clicking against tile, sharp and deliberate. He stood at the foot of the bed for exactly 4 seconds, watching the oxygen saturation climb from 78 to 84 to 90, and Laura saw something flicker across his face, not relief, but calculation. He didn't acknowledge her. He pulled out his cell phone and turned toward the corner, his voice dropping to the practiced softness of institutional power. The first call went to Harold Bancroft, the hospital board chairman, and Caldwell's words were sparse, clinical. The nurse in trauma performed an unauthorized procedure. Thoracotomy. Outside her scope entirely. We need legal and risk management on this now. He listened, nodded though no one could see him, then disconnected. The second call came 2 minutes later, this time to the hospital's legal counsel, and again the same measured delivery, the same careful framing, reckless, unauthorized, a liability exposure that could cost them millions. The third call was to security, and this time his voice carried a different edge, the voice of a man who'd moved beyond explanation into command. I want Nurse Bennett's access badge deactivated immediately. She's to be escorted off the premises. And I need her cell phone confiscated before she leaves the floor. She's not to speak to anyone. He ended the call and turned to face Laura directly for the first time since he'd arrived. His eyes were the color of dishwater, and they moved across her face like she was a problem someone else should have solved already. You're done here, Nurse Bennett. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Security arrived 6 minutes later, 2 officers Laura had seen in the cafeteria before, men whose names she'd never learned and who would never learn hers. One of them reached for her badge, the other held out his palm. Cell phone, please. She removed the badge from around her neck and placed it in the first officer's hand. She handed over the phone she'd owned for 3 years, the one her sister called on birthdays, the one she deleted the Pentagon contact from the morning she started at Oak Creek Memorial. The plastic was still warm from her pocket. You're on immediate suspension pending investigation, the officer said, reading from a sheet someone, Caldwell, had already prepared. You're to turn in all hospital property and exit through the service entrance. Don't cause a scene. They escorted her down the back hallway, past supply closets and equipment racks, past the spaces where nobody looked and nobody asked questions. The basement corridor smelled like wet concrete and industrial bleach, the fluorescent lights casting everything in shades of institutional gray. At the end of the hallway, a break room attendant handed her a plastic bag containing her personal effects, a half-empty coffee thermos, her street shoes, a hoodie she'd left in her locker. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. She dressed in silence, each movement deliberate, muscle memory taking over because thinking about what was happening would require her to feel it, and feeling it would require her to break, and breaking wasn't an option that had ever existed for her. The hospital laundry room was at the far end of the basement, accessible by a service stairwell that opened into a space that smelled like industrial detergent and steam, where folded linen sat in neat stacks and a single window looked out onto the loading dock. Laura moved toward the soiled linens bin, and someone had placed her blooded scrubs there already. Someone with mercy and terrible efficiency had removed them from the trauma bay before she could ask. The surgical mask was still clipped to the neckline, the dried blood rust-colored under the fluorescent light. She pulled out the scrubs, layer by layer, examining the stains the way a researcher might examine evidence. The blood had soaked through in distinct patterns, the thoracotomy cut, the compressions, the moment the internal bleeding had drained across her gloved hands. Each stain was a map of something she'd done in the dark. She moved to the folding table and began to work the fabric with her hands, muscle memory precise, each fold exact. Fold. Crease. Press. Fold. Crease. Press. The rhythm was almost meditative, almost clean. In Marjah, after the compound collapsed and her team didn't come out, she'd sat in a field hospital for 3 days with a broken rib and a dislocated shoulder, and she'd folded bandages, the same way, the same precision, because folding meant she wasn't thinking about the 6 Rangers she'd left behind, and not thinking was the only survival skill that mattered. Her hands worked the fabric now as if they were speaking a language her conscious mind couldn't access, and she understood something fundamental about grief: it was just muscle memory with nowhere to go. The Pentagon had ordered her to die in Marjah. They'd built intelligence networks on the fiction of her death, covert operations on the assumption that Major Laura Bennett no longer existed, and she'd accepted that erasure because the alternative was sacrificing the people still operating under her ghost. She'd been given a new social security number, a new name, a new set of fingerprints in the system. Everything changed except her hands and her memory and the knowledge of what she could do in a crisis. For 3 years she'd been invisible, and invisibility had been her second uniform, safer than any jacket, more protective than any title. She'd folded her old life away and accepted a new one that asked nothing of her except that she remain silent, remain small, remain nobody. Now even that borrowed identity was gone. The hospital administrator had already drafted the termination letter in Caldwell's presence. She'd heard him reading it aloud through the trauma bay door, performing procedures outside scope of practice, insubordination, compromising patient safety through reckless ego. Caldwell had offered his diagnosis with the confidence of a man who'd never encountered a consequence. The most dangerous person in a hospital is someone who thinks they're smarter than the protocols. He'd had no idea that the protocols he revered were designed by people like her, field-tested under fire, built on the graves of soldiers who died because someone followed rules instead of saving lives. She placed the first folded pair of scrubs in the return bin. The fabric was still warm. She picked up the second pair and began again, fold, crease, press, moving with deliberate slowness because this was the last time she would fold hospital linens, the last time she would wear scrubs, the last time this borrowed identity would mean anything. Each fold felt like a small funeral, each crease a moment of respect for the lie she'd lived here. She was on the final pair, the surgical mask already clipped neatly to the collar, when she heard it, a sound that made every cell in her body recognize itself. Rotor blades. Deep, rhythmic thunder approaching from above, the unmistakable percussion of a helicopter descending through Houston airspace. The sound grew louder, closer, and the small window above the folding table rattled in its frame. The entire laundry room shook, ceiling tiles trembling, folded linen sliding slightly on their stacks, the industrial fluorescent light fixture swinging in tight arcs. Another helicopter arrived, then a third, the sound now so loud it was physical, it was pressure, it was a presence that changed the air itself. The window vibrated against the casing. Outside, the loading dock transformed into something Laura's body recognized before her mind caught up, a landing zone. She pressed down on the final fold of her scrubs, and the sound reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the building down to its foundation. Rotor wash began clearing the parking lot in visible waves, dust and debris rising in spirals. The sound wasn't just noise anymore, it was arrival. It was authority. It was the sound of people who didn't ask permission and didn't accept excuses, descending on Oak Creek Memorial Hospital in Houston, Texas, asking for someone who didn't officially exist. Laura's hand still gripped the folded scrubs. She didn't move. She didn't look up from the table. She was still pressing down on the final crease when she heard the laundry room door slam open hard enough to bounce against the wall. Marcus's sister burst through the laundry room door like it had personally offended her, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her voice breaking on words that shouldn't exist in a hospital hallway. "They're asking for Major Bennett. Not nurse. Not Laura. Major." The word hung in the steam rising from the folding table like a ghost taking solid form. Laura's hand stilled on the final crease of her scrubs, that white fabric now stained with Marcus's blood like a confession written in copper. She didn't look up. Not yet. Some silences carry weight that words can't move. 2 Army Rangers in full dress uniform appeared in the doorway, their dress blues crisp enough to cut, their boots reflecting the fluorescent glare like dark mirrors. They moved in perfect synchronization, the kind of precision that comes from 1,000 hours of protocol embedded into muscle and bone. One of them stepped forward, his jaw set with the kind of calm that only exists in men trained to hold it under fire. He raised his right hand, fist to chest, and saluted with a snap that sounded like a flag unfurling in wind. The other followed a half-second later, mirror image, identical, deliberate. It wasn't a request. It was a command in the language of respect. It was recognition. Laura looked up then, her eyes meeting theirs for exactly 2 seconds before she straightened, her spine finding an alignment it hadn't held in 3 years, and returned the salute with the precision of someone who'd spent 17 years in the structure of military bearing. Her hand came down. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The hospital administrator arrived moments later, his face the color of old chalk, trembling the way men tremble when they've just realized the ground beneath them has been hollow all along. He held Laura's personnel file like it might explode, his hands shaking so badly the papers rustled in irregular rhythms, the sound of institutional collapse made audible. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Started again, his voice barely above a whisper at first, then finding strength as he read aloud from documents that should never have been redacted, that should have been framed on her office wall instead of buried in some basement file with a clearance stamp that had expired with yesterday's sunrise. Bronze Star. He paused. Laura's face didn't change. 2 purple hearts. Another pause, longer this time. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system breathing. Silver Star. His voice cracked on the last one like he was confessing sin someone else had committed. He lowered the file, stared at Laura as if seeing her for the first time, as if the fluorescent lights had suddenly revealed a woman made of something harder than flesh and bone. That was when the Navy SEAL team leader stepped forward, a man whose face carried the particular weathering of someone who'd spent more nights in desert valleys than in his own home. His uniform had the kind of decoration that made rank meaningless, the medals themselves became the authority in the room. He looked at Laura the way soldiers look at other soldiers who've stood in the space between life and death and refused to blink, and he began speaking her credentials one by one like he was reading sacred text. Each word landed with the weight of witness. Each name of each operation, each region, each date became a testament to something Caldwell had tried to bury under the fiction that she was just another nurse, just another body filling a shift, just another woman whose courage could be dismissed because it came wrapped in scrubs instead of dress blues. The SEAL's voice carried the authority of someone who'd been saved by her hands, who'd watched her move through chaos with the precision of someone for whom danger was merely another variable to calculate. With each decoration named, he watched Caldwell's face transform, the gray spreading through his skin like spilled ink, his jaw going slack, his eyes moving to the exits as if calculating escape velocity. The SEAL finished with a single sentence that seemed to contain all 17 years of classified operations Laura had carried in silence. Major Bennett saved my life in Marjah in 2011. She did it while everyone else was running. The Marine veteran IT director stepped forward then, a stocky man in his 50s whose Marine Corps tattoo was visible below his rolled sleeve, faded but still holding color. He held a tablet the way a prosecutor holds evidence, the way a man holds proof that the world still contains consequences. His voice was steady, the way voices get when speaking truths that can't be unmade, can't be rewritten, can't be explained away with institutional policy or hospital precedent. Dr. Caldwell, 20 minutes ago you attempted to delete security footage from our server. All of it. 72 hours of footage. Including recordings of your phone calls. Including your refusal to treat Sergeant Marcus Hayes. Including your orders to other physicians to avoid his case. The IT director turned the tablet around, showing Caldwell his own face on screen, timestamp glowing in the corner like a court date written in light. Our system auto-backs up to an off-site server every 15 minutes. I'm a Marine. When I saw what you were trying to delete, I preserved every frame and forwarded it to the State Medical Board, the Hospital Ethics Committee, and the VA Office of Inspector General. The tablet showed Caldwell's hands, Caldwell's profile, Caldwell's deliberate actions playing back in silent testimony. 3 copies. 3 destinations. All protected. Caldwell's phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the tile floor with a sound like something breaking that couldn't be repaired. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again and produced nothing except a whisper that nobody needed to hear. The hospital board chairman arrived, flanked by attorneys whose suits cost more than Caldwell's house payment, their briefcases containing the machinery of institutional self-preservation. The Marine colonel who'd led the Rangers didn't wait for questions. The VA, the Army Criminal Investigation Division, and the State Medical Board are all opening investigations. Dr. Caldwell's medical license is suspended pending review. He will cooperate fully or face charges of obstruction and evidence tampering. It wasn't a threat. It was a sentence being read aloud. Security arrived, 2 guards in Navy uniforms, and they approached Caldwell with the kind of gentle firmness reserved for men who've already lost everything and simply don't know it yet. He walked between them toward the exit, not Laura this time, not some nurse being escorted out through the service entrance like a problem being removed from view, but Caldwell himself, the architect of his own unmaking, moving through a crowd of nurses and residents and attending physicians he'd once commanded with threats and policy and the casual cruelty of a man protected by institutional momentum. One resident whispered, "He made us refuse that patient." Another said, "He told me it was policy." A third didn't speak at all, just watched with eyes that had learned something they'd never forget. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then someone started clapping. 5 years later, Laura Bennett ran the VA's experimental treatment program from an office in Washington, D.C., her title reading Director of Combat Trauma Innovation, a position that had been created specifically because someone very high up in the Pentagon had decided that the woman who'd saved Marcus Hayes deserved more than gratitude, she deserved authority. Her office occupied the 5th floor of a building that smelled of new construction and institutional money, and on her desk sat a small frame containing the faded 75th Regiment patch, the one that had been sewn inside Marcus's jacket lining, the one piece of Marjah she'd allowed herself to keep. She'd held it every morning for a year after leaving Houston, and then one day the weight of it had lightened. Not because she'd forgotten. Because she'd finally been allowed to remember openly. Marcus had recovered fully, his spine healing better than the doctors had predicted, his determination working like an additional vertebra, something internal that straightened what metal and surgery had tried to restore. He'd returned to limited duty as a Ranger instructor and sent her a Christmas card every year with a photo of his growing family, 2 daughters, then a son, then another daughter, the evidence of life continuing, of futures that the 15 doctors who'd refused his care had nearly erased. 15 refusals. That number had never left her. 4 of those doctors had lost their licenses after ethics reviews. The rest had accepted suspensions and mandatory retraining, a penance that involved continuing to hear about what they'd refused to do, learning in classrooms what Laura had known in her hands that 3rd night in March. Dr. Richard Caldwell sold supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall in suburban Houston, his medical license permanently revoked after investigators discovered he'd systematically discouraged treatment for combat veterans to protect the hospital's malpractice statistics and boost his performance bonuses, a detail that had made even the federal agents processing the case go quiet for a long moment. Every day he sat at that table in an open-air corridor with fluorescent lights humming overhead like the sound of institutional memory, watching people pass by, watching some of them recognize him, watching them keep walking. The hospital board issued a formal apology and endowed a scholarship in Laura's name, which meant that every year, 3 new nurses received funding specifically to study battlefield medicine, specifically to honor someone who'd been invisible in the place she'd healed. On a Tuesday morning in November, Laura briefed a room of military physicians on new field trauma protocols developed from her research. A young Army doctor raised his hand and asked, "How did you know the thoracotomy would work on Sergeant Hayes with the resources you had available?" Laura looked at the faded patch sitting on her desk back in her office. She was thinking about it now, could see it as clearly as if it were in this room. She paused for exactly 2 seconds, then answered in a voice that carried 17 years of silence and 3 nights of clarity. "Because I learned a long time ago that power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." After the briefing concluded, she walked to Walter Reed Medical Center to visit active duty patients still learning to move through the world with spinal injuries, still discovering what their bodies could do when their minds refused to accept limitation. In a hallway on the orthopedic ward, a nurse stopped her, recognition and something like reverence crossing her face in equal measure. "Major Bennett? I read about what you did in Houston. It's the reason I went back to school for my DNP." Laura smiled, and it was the kind of smile that contained everything, the laundry room, the blood on her scrubs, the sound of helicopter rotors descending like judgment. Then it was worth it, she said, and continued down the hallway, her limp barely visible now unless you were looking for it, her posture straight, no longer invisible but no longer hiding either. In room 347 at a different hospital on a different coast, another veteran was waiting for someone who wouldn't give up, someone who'd understand that recovery wasn't about accepting the doctor's verdict but about refusing it with the quiet force of evidence. Laura reviewed the intake file, felt the familiar weight of someone else's impossible case settling across her shoulders like something she was built to carry, and she got to work. Outside, rain began to hammer the windows like applause from a war she'd survived, like the sound of permission finally arriving 7 years too late but arriving all the same. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm curious, comment below and tell us if you're watching this alone or with family. Now let's see how this unfolds.